The threat of nuclear war has haunted our imaginations since the development and use of the first atomic bombs in the 1940s. Those of us who were alive during the Cold War lived under the shadow of complete nuclear annihilation. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that threat receded. But today, with every month that goes by, the threat of nuclear war seems to be growing once again. We've seen senior Russian officials threaten to use nuclear weapons in the Ukraine conflict. The US just announced it had made a nuclear bomb 24 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. Now war has broken out between nuclear-armed Israel and Hamas over the Gaza Strip. This is yet another war involving a nuclear-armed state, this one threatening to consume the Middle East. And the elephant in the room is the possibility of an even wider conflict in which nuclear-armed powers like NATO, China, and Russia go to war with potentially devastating consequences for everyone on the planet. In this episode of the New Age 2026 series, we're going to see how astrology tells the story of our nuclear nightmare and explains why the threat of nuclear war has returned at this particular moment in time. As you can no doubt tell, this episode won't be for the faint of heart. So pour yourself a wee dram, or put the kettle on, and let's get into this. Now, before we really get into this, I just want to remind you that if you're interested in learning what astrology says about you and your life, you can book a private consultation with me. I use a variety of traditional and modern techniques to help my clients situate themselves in time, find purpose and calling in the world, and navigate these very strange times. And I'm also available for electional consultations, where I will find you the best possible moment in time to initiate new projects and endeavors, as long as you're not doing something evil. Find the details in the description below. In the last episode of this series, we saw how conjunctions of Pluto and Neptune in 1891 and 1892 at 7 and 8 Gemini initiated a new 500-year cycle concerning themes of faith, belief, and consciousness. And I put forward a theory that this cycle will have to do with the theme of integrating spirit and science. And I came to that conclusion because among the major developments of that period with the occult revival of theosophy and other movements, and the incredible developments in science and technology at that time. Now, I don't think there's anybody out there who would disagree that the 20th century was a time of dizzying scientific progress in countless fields. And if there's one invention that symbolizes the dark side of that progress, it's the nuclear bomb. The first human-instigated nuclear explosion that we're aware of took place on July the 16th, 1945. This was the so-called Trinity Test, and it was the culmination of the Manhattan Project, which was led by J. Robert Oppenheimer, whose name has returned to public consciousness recently with the release of the Christopher Nolan movie bearing his name. As we all know, shortly after that successful test, nuclear weapons were unleashed on actual human beings, with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of that same year, killing perhaps as many as 226,000 people and forcing the surrender of Japan in the Second World War. You could argue that the use of those nuclear bombs was the defining moment of the 20th century, one that revealed the sheer devastating power that science had put into the hands of our, let's just say, less than mature species. And here's where this starts to get really interesting, because if you go to the US Department of Energy's own website, you'll find a history of the Manhattan Project, and you'll never guess where that history starts. Yes, it starts in the 1890s, which is, of course, the period of the conjunctions of Pluto and Neptune that initiated the current 500-year cycle. Well, fancy that. The Department of Energy has very good reasons for starting its history of the Manhattan Project in the 1890s, because there were several discoveries at that time that were crucial to the development of nuclear weapons. In 1896, a French physicist, Antoine Becquerel, discovered radioactivity, the same year that the husband and wife team of Marie and Pierre Curie were studying the emission of radiation from uranium and thorium. And in 1897, an English physicist named J.J. Thomson made the first discovery of a particle that was smaller than an atom. He discovered the electron. And one more major development came right at the end of that conjunctional period, because in 1905, Albert Einstein, who supposedly had a copy of Blavatsky's secret doctrine on his desk, devised his famous equation that showed how matter is convertible into energy, E equals mc squared. And so, in our conjunctional period, the stage for the nuclear age was set. Where things get truly compelling is when we begin to trace the Pluto-Neptune cycle as those two planets made their first aspects, because these aspects really tell the story of the 20th century. Now, if you're enjoying this video, then please just click that little like button. And if you're not subscribed, why not do that now and make sure you catch the rest of this series. Synodic cycles are the cycles that we perceive from observing the relative movement around the zodiac of pairs of planets from the perspective of the Earth. And as two planets move around the zodiac, they form angles with each other, which we astrologers call aspects. Now, mundane astrological theory holds that we see key developments in the stories of these cycles when the planets concerned make aspects. In my own practice, I tend to concentrate on the so-called major aspects. Following a conjunction, these are the waxing sextile, which is the 60-degree aspect, the waxing square, the 90-degree aspect, the waxing trine, the 120-degree aspect, the opposition, which is the 180-degree aspect, and then the waning trine, waning square, and waning sextile. These are the aspects that were used by traditional astrologers and are often referred to as Ptolemaic aspects, after the influential Alexandrian astrologer, mathematician, and geographer Claudius Ptolemy, who categorized them back in the 2nd century. But why do we see events happening at aspects? Well, as Nikola Tesla said, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Remember, astrology is the music of the spheres. Aspects are moments of harmonic resonance in these cycles of vibration. Think of the ways a guitar string can vibrate and produce different notes. But there are other aspects beyond the Ptolemaic, the so-called minor aspects, most of which were first identified by the astrologer Johannes Kepler in the early 17th century. Now, I haven't made much mention of the minor aspects on this channel before, not because I don't think they're valid, but because the major aspects tend to speak louder in mundane astrology. But I'm going to make an exception in this series. And the reason for that is that the Pluto-Neptune cycle is very slow, slow enough that its minor aspects signify truly major events. And we're still early in the Pluto-Neptune cycle right now. It's a 500-year cycle. We're only 130 years in. So every aspect that we can get our hands on can help us to understand what this cycle is really concerned with. And so the first aspect we're going to consider in this series is not the first major aspect, the sextile, but the semisextile, which is half a sextile or 30 degrees. In Horoscope Symbols, the great Robert Hand writes that the nature of this aspect combines the passive nature of sextiles and trines with the tension and unease typically associated with squares. Pluto and Neptune made 3 exact semisextiles in 1916 and 1917. Now, one thing about minor aspects is that they require much tighter orbs than major aspects. But I'm going to follow Hand in Horoscope Symbols and use an orb of 1.5 degrees for the semisextile. That means Pluto and Neptune were in semisextile between roughly 1914 and 1919. And it hardly needs spelling out that that is an intriguing range of time, because it almost perfectly bookends the First World War. Now, there are plenty of other astrological factors that you could identify as signaling the outbreak of that war, most notably the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions of 1914 and 1915, and the Pluto-Eris square that I discussed in this video. But I think the Pluto-Neptune semisextile is another factor to add to the list, because one major theme of this Pluto-Neptune cycle is globalization and the consequent formation of global consciousness. In my opinion, world wars can be seen as the birth pangs of a global civilization coming into manifestation. What's important for our purposes today is that some crucial moments in the story of the development of the nuclear bomb came at this semisextile. In 1913, the Danish physicist Niels Bohr developed a model of the atom that rather resembled the solar system, with electrons orbiting a nucleus in shells. and emitting or absorbing radioactivity when they move from one shell to another. And then in 1917, when the semisextile was almost exact, the Kiwi physicist Ernest Rutherford, working at the University of Cambridge, proved the existence of another of the core components of the atom, the proton. So at this point, we had discovered the negatively charged electron, which orbits the nucleus of the atom, and the positively charged proton, which is found within the nucleus. But if you know a bit about physics, you'll know that we were missing the third of the three fundamental components of the atom here. Surely that wasn't discovered at a Pluto-Neptune aspect too? There is a second minor aspect we're going to consider here, and that is the 45-degree aspect, the semi-square, which is half of the 90-degree major aspect, the square. And as Hans says, these are not weak aspects. They represent dynamic moments of crisis, although they're nevertheless weaker than squares. Pluto and Neptune made 5 exact semi-squares between 1930 and 1932, and were within 1.5 degrees of orb between roughly 1928 and 1934. And once again, if you know the history of the 20th century, you'll realize that this period was also crucially important. We had the Wall Street crash of 1929, which led to hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic and Hitler's takeover of Germany in 1933. And this was also when Pluto itself was discovered in 1930. Pluto has been taken by astrologers to signify the unleashing of powerful hidden forces and the interchange between the very small and the very large. But this period was also crucial in the story of the atom bomb, because in 1932, the year Pluto and Neptune were making exact semi-squares, a colleague of Rutherford, James Chadwick, discovered the third key component of the atom, the neutron. And the same year, 2 scientists, J.D. Cockcroft and E.T.S. Walton, used a kind of primitive particle accelerator to bombard lithium with protons, and they became the first people to split the atom. And so scientists had created a working model of the components of the atom by this time, and the major discoveries had all come at aspects of the Pluto-Neptune cycle. And you'll notice that there's a strange kind of synchronicity here between the unlocking of the power of the atom and the rise of fascism and the story of the world wars. All these threads would reach a grim culmination when the first major aspect of the cycle, the sextile, came into orb in the 1940s. And so now I'm going to show you another chart that I think all historians should be made to look at, because it's one that tells the story of the entire 20th century and onto our present day. This chart is taken from the excellent Archetypal Explorer website, which allows you to visualize aspects as they come in and out of effect over time. It shows the sextile between Pluto and Neptune coming into orb. And as we're going to see, it tells a story about the past 130 years of history. Now, the y-axis here runs from 10 to 0. So when we see a line emerging at the bottom of the chart, we know that at that time, Pluto and Neptune have moved to within 10 degrees of a sextile. And the peaks of this chart show when the sextile is going exact. Now, first of all, you can see the curve rising up in the 1940s. This is the sextile coming into orb. This is the time when we could expect to see the promises of the Pluto-Neptune conjunctions of 1891 and 1892 really beginning to come into manifestation. And I think it's fair to say that it was the defining period of the century, the period of the Second World War, and the time when human beings finally mastered nuclear fission and then created, tested, and used the first atomic bombs in war. It's also defining in many other important ways that we're going to explore in future episodes of this series. I'll leave you in suspense on that for now. This is another one of those incredibly compelling demonstrations of the validity of astrology that you come across pretty much all the time, actually. But there are some other important things that this chart tells us. Firstly, the vertical line in the chart shows our present moment. So you'll have noticed that Pluto and Neptune have been in sextile since the 1940s and have remained in that sextile to this day. And there's a good reason why this has happened. It has to do with Pluto's orbit, which is highly elliptical. Pluto takes 250 years to orbit the Sun, while Neptune takes about 165 years. But there are times when Pluto is relatively close to the Sun, when it moves around the zodiac much faster than normal. This is known as its perihelion. When Pluto is close to perihelion, it's moving around the zodiac at roughly the same speed as Neptune. And the result of this is that the two planets maintain roughly the same angular distance between each other for long periods of time. This also happened from the mid-15th century to the mid-16th century. This was the revolutionary period of time we looked at during the last Pluto-Neptune cycle, when the printing press emerged, the Reformation happened, Copernicus came out with his heliocentric theory, and Europeans began their conquest of the Americas. If you haven't seen it already, we dealt with this in this episode. And this is happening again right now. One consequence of this is that the vast majority of people alive today, basically everyone born since the 1940s, has a Pluto-Neptune sextile in their natal chart. And so we have a period of time when almost all of us are living through an astrological event that we also happen to have baked into our own charts and potentially into our own natures. You might want to take a big toke and ponder that for a moment. But there's something else you'll notice about this chart. There are 3 periods when we see series of peaks, which means that the Pluto-Neptune sextiles were perfecting, they were going exact. One here, and one about to begin in 2026. Pluto and Neptune began making exact sextiles in 1950 and did so each year until 1956. And they made a second set of exact sextiles each year from 1976 to 1986. Now, the closer an aspect is, the more powerful it is. So we would expect that the significations of the Pluto-Neptune sextile are going to express themselves more strongly at those times when the sextile is going exact. These are going to be moments when the promises of the cycle's conjunctional period are very obviously coming to fruition. And we can also see that between those first 2 periods of exact sextiles, this stretch of time here, from 1956 to 1976, the sextile remained pretty close. Pluto and Neptune drifted apart a little bit, but not much. They only started to really separate after the last set of exact conjunctions ended in 1986, and we got this much deeper dip. And here's what I think we can read from this. This long period, from the late 1940s to the late 1980s, when the sextiles were tight, coincides almost precisely with the Cold War, which effectively began after the Second World War ended and fell apart from 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And what was one of the defining features of the Cold War? Well, it was the threat of nuclear annihilation that hung over everyone on the planet during that period. During this period, several countries developed nuclear weapons, and we saw a lot of nuclear testing. Here's a chart showing the number of nuclear tests taking place in the world each year through the 20th century. And what's truly striking is if we overlay these 2 charts, we can see how the sextile being close coincides with periods when significant nuclear testing was taking place. And here's another chart showing the numbers of nuclear weapons themselves in existence in the world each year. What this chart shows is that the number of nuclear weapons in the world reached a peak in the year 1986. Yes, that's the last time in which Pluto and Neptune made exact sextiles. This is starting to get pretty weird, isn't it? Now, if you're following the logic here, then you might start to understand why we're seeing the threat of nuclear war once again rearing its ugly head, because we're getting closer and closer to 2026, when a new period of exact Pluto-Neptune sextiles will begin. And so I'll come out with a question you're no doubt asking. Are we heading towards nuclear war? There have been several moments in history when we narrowly escaped global nuclear war. The most famous is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in 1962. In that episode, the Soviets tried to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, very close to the United States, and the result was almost total war between the US and the USSR, and that would have been a nuclear war. Here's where this happened in the chart, during the period where Pluto and Neptune were still pretty close to a sextile. Now, there is another very well-known moment when we almost saw a nuclear war, and it happened in 1983. On September the 26th, 1983, Soviet detection systems falsely reported incoming ballistic missiles from the United States. And Soviet nuclear doctrine would have mandated a nuclear response to those missiles. We were only saved from apocalypse because a Russian engineer and hero named Stanislav Petrov chose to wait for more evidence before reporting the Phantom missiles and effectively saved the world. Thanks, Stanislav. But actually, there have been a lot of nuclear near misses over the years. Go to this Wikipedia page and you will find enough incidents to wonder how the hell we're still even alive on this planet. And something else you'll see is there were only a couple in the period of the Big Dip, after the Cold War had ended, and they weren't particularly close calls. As we've seen, Pluto and Neptune are getting closer once again to perfecting their sextiles, and they'll start making exact sextiles from 2026, and they'll do so every year until 2032. I think it's absolutely no coincidence that once again, as we approach 2026, we're returning to a time when the threat of nuclear war hangs heavy over us all. And that period may last until the mid-2030s. Now that's a long period of time, but are there any times of particular risk? Well, I think there are. We can identify some of them by understanding the astrological signatures of nuclear technology. As we've already seen, the nuclear age began in the 1940s. To be more precise, it can be said to have truly begun at 3:25 p.m. on December the 2nd, 1942, when scientists at the University of Chicago started the first controlled nuclear fission reaction in our history. This was essentially the creation of the world's first nuclear reactor, and it made everything from nuclear power to nuclear weapons possible. And here's the chart for that reaction. We can take this chart as the chart for the nuclear age. Shout out to Nick Campion for identifying this chart in his book of world horoscopes. Firstly, we see Saturn at 8 Gemini. And 8 Gemini, you will remember, is the degree of 2 of the 3 Pluto-Neptune conjunctions of 1891 and 1892. Saturn is a planet of science and concrete manifestation. And here we see the real manifestation of the nuclear age promised at the Pluto-Neptune conjunctions with Saturn at 8 Gemini. And if we think for a moment, what is fission? In fission, the nuclei of heavy elements like uranium and plutonium are split into 2 or more constituent elements. Now think of Gemini, the sign of the twins. But to return to 8 Gemini for a moment, we can see how the presence of that degree in this chart ties it to the great themes of this Pluto-Neptune cycle. And what's interesting is it's far from the only nuclear chart that features this part of the zodiac. After the fission experiment of 1942, Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project continued its work towards creating a nuclear bomb. And by 1945, with Germany already defeated in World War II, they were ready to test a device. This was the so-called Trinity Test, held close to Los Alamos. This was the moment when Oppenheimer is supposed to have quoted the Bhagavad Gita, and those famous words, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And here's the chart for the Trinity Test. And look, there's Venus at 9 Gemini. Shortly afterwards, in August of 1945, the Americans dropped 2 nuclear bombs on live targets, the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here's the chart for the Hiroshima bomb. And would you believe it? There's Mars, the god of war, at 9 Gemini. And here's a more recent example. On January the 12th of this year, our good friend Mars, the war planet, stationed direct at the degree of, you guessed it, 8 Gemini. And on January the 19th, with Mars still almost stationary at 8 Gemini, former Russian president and close ally of Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Medvedev, made a public statement directed at NATO. He said that if Russia were defeated in Ukraine, the result would be nuclear war. So this part of the zodiac is intimately connected with the themes of nuclear technology and weapons. We consistently see those themes coming up when it's stimulated. And here's another little nugget for you. Here's the Sibley chart of the United States, dated to the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And if we look at 8 Gemini, what do we find there? Why, it's Uranus, the planet of freedom, sudden change, technology, and revelation. I think this suggests that the United States has a very special role to play in this Pluto-Neptune cycle. It was the US which developed and used the first nuclear bombs, and the US has been the major driver of globalization over the past century. We'll come back to this theme again later in the series. And now we're going to try and bring this all together. There are two major conclusions to draw from what we've seen in this episode. The first is that as we move closer to 2026, we seem to be returning to a time when we have the threat of nuclear war hanging over our heads. We're returning to a psycho-spiritual climate of apocalypticism. Now, that doesn't mean we're all going to die in a nuclear holocaust, but it does mean that we're probably going to have to get used to the threat of it hanging over us once again in the years to come. And the second conclusion here is that we should keep an eye on the vicinity of 8 Gemini and the star Aldebaran. We're going to do a deeper dive into what's coming in the future in a later episode of this series, because there are a few more threads around this Pluto-Neptune cycle that we need to investigate before we can really do that. But I'll note for now that Uranus will enter Gemini in 2025, move permanently into the sign in 2026, and be in the vicinity of 8 Gemini from 2027 and through the last years of the decade. This will also mark the period of the Uranus return of the United States and of the Second World War and of the development of the nuclear bomb. So that's about it for this episode. But as Steve Jobs and Columbo used to say, there's just one last thing. If you follow my channel, you'll already have heard me talking a lot about the degree of 8 Gemini, but for a different reason. Because there's another theme that we've already encountered in this series, one that's connected to this Pluto-Neptune cycle and thus to 8 Gemini. I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. Now I can almost hear you asking, Dan, why can't you just claim that the development of nuclear weapons is correlated to the movements of two extremely distant planets like a normal, rational human being? Why do you have to keep bringing UFOs into this all the time? Well, I'm sorry, but I just can't help myself, and I genuinely think they're a crucial part of this story. In the next episode of this series, we're going to examine the connections between the UFO phenomenon and nuclear weapons. And we're going to see how both astrology and history show that these phenomena are intimately connected. Get your tinfoil hat ready, and I'll see you next time.